The biggest learning has been that it's okay to pivot. Your first idea may not be the one in terms of what you want to build. For me, there was a lot of shame around that. So it took a while to kind of be okay with that. But that's my biggest learning, I suppose, that when we jump in with that passion and idea, whatever it is, and we're very committed to making it work, it's kind of knowing when to pivot or, do something else.
Our featured speaker today is a healthcare entrepreneur and a SaaS leader with a career spanning 3 continents. Sangheetha, it is such a pleasure to have you as our featured guest today. Thank you so much for being willing to share your journey with us.
Thank you, Nancy. It's lovely to be here. And hello to everybody else on this call as well.
Thank you so much. I was wondering if you might kick us off just talking about your experience growing up and maybe some of the early life events or mentors that you feel influenced your personal and professional development.
Yeah, sure. I was born and raised in India. That's where I went to school. I had a very, typical upbringing where it was very achievement oriented, and there was definitely a focus on education. That was kind of the backdrop. Did well, went to sort of like an Ivy League school in India called BITS Pilani. As you do, I guess, when you go to a university like that, you meet people from all over the country. It really kind of shaped my understanding and perspective of life. It teaches you to dream big. It teaches you to be curious and open about life. So I would say the 4 years that I spent in my undergrad college was a big part of who I am today. I don't come from a family of entrepreneurs, so there's nobody kind of in my immediate circle that I could look up to or look at. And I thought it wasn't in the cards until kind of later in life. I went to the US for my master's, and then I went to work for a startup. And I just absolutely loved working for a tech startup. I just loved being a part of that team, but I never thought it was something that I wanted to do until much later in life. And then I moved to the UK, met my husband, we dated, got married, wanted to start a family. And that's kind of, I think for me, that was the major sort of catalyst. It's actually through my pregnancies and the birth of my daughter, for me, it was like, what kind of world do I want to bring them in? And it was almost like gave me a chance to ask some, sort of bigger questions. And that's when I started exploring entrepreneurship, although more at an academic level. The original sort of idea or thing that I was exploring at that point was nonprofit entrepreneurship. And that's kind of what I went to. Then UPenn was offering like an executive program in social impact. And so that was quite transformative. But, as I was finishing up the program, that's when I had my second one. So then, it felt like I didn't know. I was at crossroads. Even then, it was pretty academic. Even at that point, it's sort of like, and I come from a strategy consulting background. So, how I needed Excel sheets and business model canvases and all of that. And, one thing I've learned now is that there's only so much all of that can do, and there's nothing that can substitute just sort of jumping in and learning, which I've done now. I think for me, I don't want to sound cinematic when I say this. The birth of my second daughter, actually, Swara, both my daughters were planned home births in the UK, which is legal. There's a midwife, there's a doula, pretty well supported. With my older one, Laya, we transferred into the hospital, and then younger one, Swara, was born at home in my living room, in a pool, supported by midwives. And it was just one of those surreal kind of life-changing moments. It's one of those things I remember thinking, okay, my body could do this. What else can I do? That was the jumping off point, I think, for me.
I really love that sentiment. I often think of giving birth as an athletic event, and there are athletes that can relate to that statement that you just made that, my body did this. What else am I capable of? That's amazing. I was wondering if you could go into how you became a doula and kind of the inspiration behind starting Chennai Birth Network.
Yeah, I think, like I said, my birth was the starting point of that thinking. And then, I had 2 daughters, and there's a lot of discussion, like thoughts around how am I going to raise these children? What kind of a world am I bringing them into and all of that. And I grew up in quite a conservative South Asian sort of culture. There's a lot around patriarchy and the systemic that has always keenly bothered me. I've always been a feminist, and I think birth really sort of catalyzed it for me. I felt like I could channel that anger, I guess, into this passion.
I was wondering if you would mind volunteering one or two obstacles you've encountered, what you did to get through them, and what they taught you, if you would change anything, etc.
Yeah. So where this journey, and so I was doing this, and then the plan was to relocate to India. That's when I went to boot camp also. It was crazy, moving countries with little children. And then that's when I did, probably a month after we'd moved is when I did boot camp. And for me, I was at that point where I was trying to figure out the passion, the purpose versus the business side of it. If I were to go down that route, I was never worried about whether I would find funding or mentors or, would I meet VCs? That was never an issue. But I think I wanted to take my time. I was kind of getting off of the corporate sort of, I hate to use the word rat race, but ways of working. And so because this was passion driven, I really wanted to take my time to figure it out. And I was exploring many different models and ways of working. I think in my mind, the journey that I've been on is kind of trying to, the impact versus the scale and the sustainability and, all of that. Right? I think I was caught there for quite a long time, especially because this was maternal health and passion and all of that stuff. For me, the biggest obstacle was figuring out a new country and a brand new kind of system. I'm not a doctor, or a midwife, right? A doula is somebody who provides, mental and physical support to laboring people during birth, but I don't have the medical legal responsibility for the birth outcome, right? In that sense, it was really coming in and trying to figure out the country, the geopolitical landscape, the legislation. So for me, it was more of the macro level, and then situating myself in that context and what it really meant. Like, where in this puzzle can I add value and where would I fit in? How do I make it sustainable? And in a way that's also rewarding for me personally. That was a big challenge. I took about two and a half years to figure that out. And I had the luxury of taking that time to figure that out, and which I'm really grateful for. And then what happened was the pandemic hit. And so even in India, it's the state that I'm in. What happened at that point was me kind of figuring out that my original idea of wanting to set something up that was women-centered, midwifery-led would run into pretty serious challenges here because of things that were not under my control. The socio-political stuff, the government, the legislation, all of that stuff. And then organically what happened was because I was working in trauma and I was specializing in perinatal trauma, I also became a somatic experiencing practitioner. So, and then pandemic hit. So there was lots of restrictions around birthing people and choices and all of that. So organically, my trauma therapy practice grew. So that's what I do now. And so you could call it a pivot. And so the biggest learning for me was to actually give yourself permission to do that. I think I had a lot of shame around that because, I came into it with so much passion, and I am, I will still be a birth worker and still passion, a big passion of mine. And I do a lot of the advocacy work around it. I do some pro bono work, and I do some government level sort of think tanks for high level policy making. So I kind of have carved out pieces of birth that I can still do while not burning out, right? The original idea was to try and see if I could set up a midwifery-led center here in Chennai where I am, but that's not going to work, right? So it's actually kind of acknowledging that, and I've pivoted and now it's amazing. It's really like, I love what I'm doing now, and it's scaling from a financial point of view as well, which is sustainable, right? So I think for me, the biggest learning has been that it's okay to pivot. Your first idea may not be the one in terms of what you want to build. For me, there was a lot of shame around that. So it took a while to kind of be okay with that. But that's my biggest learning, I suppose, that when we jump in with that passion and idea, whatever it is, and we're very committed to making it work, it's kind of knowing when to pivot or do something else. It's been rewarding, that part of it. And I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now without that. So no regrets.
Thank you so much, Sangeeta. And you mentioned several key points that I think are important, not only from entrepreneurial perspective, like give yourself permission to pivot, to fail, to try and do different things, but also from a mental health perspective. And you've been touching on that point during the conversation, but I wanted to ask you, especially from the perspective that you have as a practitioner, why are you so motivated to work in mental health and well-being?
I've always been interested in psychology, I guess, as a little kid. And my dad, there's a history of mental health stuff going on in my family, my grandmother. And so I've kind of witnessed that growing up. So, of course, there's a personal angle to why this had always been of interest. Just read so many books as a kid and all of that stuff. But really, I think one thing that used to scare me back then was, would I be able to draw the line? When I started seeing clients, not let it, then you figure out that you can do that. And that's what I'm doing now. But I think it's so key to whatever you do, whether it's birth or whether every role that I've had has had an element of sort of understanding human emotions. You need a lot of that in strategy consulting also. Right? So I think the human kind of behavior has always fascinated me. The more I work with birth, the more what I would see as a doula inside a birth room is what's stored in the body and what's stored as family kind of patterns. The relationship between the couple really used to come to, you could see that at the birth room, right? I mean, I think at that moment there's nowhere to hide kind of. And so you're privy to something very deep, and in terms of stuff that comes up for the woman and, her partner and what happens in the birth room. And that's kind of what led me to exploring trauma. And I tried talk therapy back in the day, and it never really felt like it got to where I wanted it to get to. And as soon as I understood the somatic, how the body stores trauma and, how the stories and how you work through it, I mean, it was life-changing for me. And then that's bringing it to clients has been really useful. And then now I'm actually bringing it to entrepreneurship and corporate world. So like, bringing somatics into workplaces, groups, what ticks, and how to marry the two up. And that's kind of where I'm at now.
I really appreciate you kind of linking that into dealing with trauma. And that's something that I've brought into my work as a personal trainer and coach as well, because it really just affects everything. And I really feel like you talking about the spouse too kind of transitions into some of the questions we're getting on the question and discussion channel from our listening group. So I'd like to hand it over to Spencer to ask his question.
Hello, Sangheetha. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm really enjoying what you're sharing with us today. What I was hoping to ask is if there are ways that men can sort of assist with the maternal health landscape, or is it more of a scenario where it's best for men to get out of the way? Because I've heard stories about men who've, for example, when their partners have been pregnant, they've trying to help or something, made decisions or something without really consulting their partner and made the wrong decision. And I don't know if it's best for men to learn more or just not assume they have the answers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Spencer. Yeah, thank you. Broadly, what happens during the gestational process when the pregnancy is going on is when the fetus is developing, it's got a very sort of young nervous system that has very little ability to regulate on its own. So, when we're born as children, we don't have the ability to regulate our temperature. We don't have the ability to regulate our bowel movement, for example. Right? So in the same way, we don't know how to, we have very limited ability to regulate the nervous system because, so we're piggybacking off of the maternal nervous system for a really long time before we develop that self-regulation skills, right? But here's the thing. So I'm not saying that it's all on the mother or the person who's pregnant. What they need is the ability to co-regulate, right? And I think that's where the role of the partner is invaluable because they can be the co-regulator. And in the birth room, it's very, when you're in the throes of labor, language can be really ineffective, right? So it's more about your body language. It's more about you embodying that sense of calm, in your shoulders, in your eyes, in the tone of your voice. So it's not so much what you're saying, but how you're saying it, right? So all of that. But some of the fantastic outcomes that I've seen is when partners are involved. And also, I think I do this about preparation is what is your role? Are you going to be a teammate? Are you going to be a witness? Are you going to be a coach? Are you going to be like a support person? So I think some of the best outcomes that I have seen in births have been where the partners have been just really regulated, and they're able to do that because they're informed. But it's not like they're talking over or making decisions on behalf of, but they're sort of there, to support, to help with the decision making, given that, the woman and baby are in the center of that experience. Having said that, men are also in their bodies, and I've seen that in the birth room as well, right? So I think these are discussions that are well worth having before they get into the birth room. If for example, I supported a couple once where the partner was an EMT, the paramedic in the front lines, and there's so much PTSD going on that, through the preparation, they decided it might be best for them to kind of stay out. And so I think that's the collaborative sort of decision-making point. The more informed you are, the better decisions, the couples can make.
Thank you so much, Sangeeta. And from what I'm getting from your answer is there's a lot of layers of complexity to the birthing process. Carlos Javier has a really good question regarding another layer of complexity. So the question is, how old are the women you help to give birth? And is it common in India to find girls from 12 to 18 years old pregnant? And definitely, how does that influence the process?
Yes, that is a very good question. Yes. In my private work, I support urban women who tend to be between, in India, 26 to about early 30s, 32, 33, kind of. But it's a very different thing when you go into the public health system. In that, my work is not necessarily one-to-one, but I work with NGOs to train mental health sort of responders that are working in the field. So I am 1 degree removed from the teen population. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the question, Carlos. I think it's a really difficult topic. Hi there. If you're enjoying this podcast, would you mind leaving us a review, a like, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform? Thanks so much. That really helps our reach. The Founders Voyage podcast is now proudly sponsored by VidOps. Kane at VidOps has been taking care of our editing since early 2024. He works efficiently, and I'm sure you'll agree that he does a great job. Thank you to VidOps for helping bring this podcast to life. If you want the same great support we're getting for your podcast, or you need help with video, photography, or animation, you can get 10% off at vidops.io using our referral code VOYAGE. That's vidops.io, referral code VOYAGE. Now back to the show.
Hey, Sangeeta. My name is Pavitra. I have a question for you. I also come from a similar background as yours. I am also from Chennai. I grew up in a similar conservative environment that you mentioned. My question for you is, thank you for sharing your thoughts around trauma, shame, and that is a huge topic that people do not have a lot of awareness in the region that we come from. And my question is, one of the things you mentioned is you're right now catering to mostly urban population, women aging somewhere between 26 through 35, 33. And my question is, what are some of the steps we can take to kind of expand this to rural communities in smaller towns? Because this is like you mentioned, this is a process or a system that is very new to India or even to so many other countries. And this is a topic that people definitely need awareness in. And what are some of the steps you're probably taking to expand this to smaller towns and communities in southern India? That's my number one question. And my second question is, you mentioned that you moved to India and you were very passionate about this work and you started this area. Did you start this alone? You mentioned that you were very new to the culture in India when you moved there. How was it when you initially wanted to start this? Did you have a set of friends, a network that you could lean on to get support? Was your husband able to support? Can you share some of your thoughts of how, or walk us through how you did it?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So the first question around how do you really expand this, I think this is personally for me, it has been about, and again, I think this is what I was mentioning, how the journey started is to really find this balance between doing the impact work versus sustaining the family, like financially, or even myself, you'd burn out otherwise. So currently what I'm doing is my trauma work is like the one-on-one, the therapy that I do is, which is mostly online, that there's a global audience for that. And in India, it tends to be the urban folk, but there are lots of really good NGOs, non-governmental organizations that are doing excellent work in the ground. Tunai is one of them. You can go look it up, thunai.org. They are trauma-informed mental health organization that is very committed to supporting people in the local language. And again, trauma is very cultural. Therefore, trauma healing also needs to be cultural, starting with the language, right? So because when the language changes, everything, you see it in the body as well. So the way I'm doing it is partnering with these organizations, big maternal. So we're doing one now it is a pretty large perinatal mental health project in government hospitals around the state. Partnering there and providing consulting for me has been very rewarding because you get to meet, there's a bit of field work, then also there's a lot of that capacity building with these organizations that I'm a part of. So that's been rewarding on that front. So that's your first question. Second one was, how did I do? So when I was in the UK and I moved to becoming a birth worker, there's a very good sort of tight-knit birth worker community in India doing fantastic work. If you ping me later, I can send you some links if you're interested. But yes, I networked with, there's a really good community of people doing fantastic work on the ground. So there is a national network, and then there is a state network, and then there's a city network. I wasn't alone in that sense, but nobody really did exactly what I was doing or wanted to do. So there was still that element of, I think I spent the first 2 years going to every hospital in the city and the state, traveled across to, and figured out how the tertiary system works, right? The government hospitals, the network of how the healthcare system really works. And again, before I left here, I'd never been inside. I mean, I was a very young person here. My uncle was a doctor, so I hadn't really, and this is also privilege. I grew up in a very urban, I had the caste privilege, I had urban education kind of privilege, so I'd never been inside a government hospital. So it's been a really amazing journey for me to actually come here and really see it in all its chaotic beauty. But, I have hope. I think, we are, this will take a generation or two, but the drive is there. So I'm hopeful.
Thank you so much, Sangeeta. And the questions have been wonderful, everybody. We have a wonderful question here that ties a lot with what you have been mentioning about the cultural specificities of mental health and attention for mothers. And the question is from Arturo. So the question is, thank you for sharing your experience with us, Sangeeta. I'm curious about your mission to decolonize approaches to mental health. What approaches do you try to promote as an alternative? And it's a wonderful, big question that I loved.
That's a big topic. And I think this for me started with decolonizing birth itself, right? And a lot of the maternity landscape and how we approach birth is really not culturally sensitive at all. And this is not just in India. I traveled and spent some time in Mexico, spending some time with midwives there and really trying to understand the system there. And there's a lot of similarities when birth moved from homes to the hospitals, and then the traditional sort of the hands-on knowledge that was inbuilt in the community was lost and it was replaced. And it's the same thing with mental health. And again, for me, the key thing is a very colonial approach to mental health is that the individual first and self-regulation before anything else. But now we know through neuroscience and through what we know about the nervous system is that co-regulation really sits at the heart of everything that happens in the nervous system, right? And it's a really core early skill that the infant builds, but also whenever our bodies have the threat response, there is an innate need for us to co-regulate. And when we do that, this ventral vagal, this is the front part of the nervous system, comes online. This is the one that tells our body that it is safe, that connection is safe, etc. Right? So I think fundamentally, there is this overemphasis on the individual as having the key to their own happiness. But again, I don't want to go all the way on the other side and say everything is relational, right? It's not that the codependent kind of, I'm not saying that, but I think there's a healthy balance flowing between the individual and the collective, which is a fundamental difference to how you approach mental health. That's one. The second thing is, I think a lot of rampant sort of labeling. I see that also as a kind of a colonial approach to mental health. Anything, and not just colonial, it's everything, right? If you can have a label, if you can have a drug, if you can make technology out of it, it exists. Otherwise, it doesn't exist, right? But mental health is also a continuum in that sense, right? So it's unlearning those. The other big thing is the therapist as the expert. Again, that is another really colonial trauma that I think we're carrying, which is not true in the therapy room, as it is not true in the birth room at all, right? Which is that the individual has lived in their body, and it's the mother that carries the baby, and everybody else around there is there to support and facilitate, and then the person is the center of the experience versus coming in as the expert. So there is a lot of power over that can be really traumatizing when you're talking about cultures where that is the problem, right? There's that inherent, power dynamics going on. So all of that, and again, culturally, how, learning and relearning and deepening into cultural humility has been hugely sort of eye-opening and rewarding journey for me. So in my work, there's a lot of emphasis on language, accent, expressive arts, things that are core in the culture itself, right? Imagery, working with metaphors and what that's like in the body. All of that is very cultural. To me, that's some of the ways in which I've decolonized my own, learning and practice.
Thank you so much, Sangeeta. And I wanted to ask you a question that I think it's fascinating for me because it's going to give us years in minutes. What do you think has been the best lesson or takeaway from your journey so far? Your words of wisdom that you can share with us?
I think it's that you have the right to exist, you have the right to take up space, and that you fundamentally belong in the largest sense. Each individual is kind of important in your own way. Unlearning shame, I think we all have so many layers of that in whatever shape or form that we accumulate as we go through life. Unlearning that you have the right to not live with all of that shame, right? So big, small, it doesn't matter. Yeah. So these have been kind of the biggest learnings, is that it's okay to take up space. And I say that knowing that there's so many layers to that about, I think there's a gender layer to that. There is all this programming. There's a cultural layer to that. There is a space for you in the world. And there's also a space for you in your own entrepreneurial journey. I think that is something that I also learned and struggled with. I've not yet, that I'll do it in my own pace and, kind of define this in my own terms. I do get caught up whenever I see a friend of mine who has raised this kind of money, and one of my friends has a company that is going to become a unicorn and all that. And there's that, the push towards, I guess, very sort of achievement oriented, how fast are we running and all that. And then it's a matter of, let's do this at our own pace. And, I want this journey to be authentic as well. And I think Pavitra asked the question about my husband. So I think I missed that. So I'm going to just cover that. Idea was to move to India, not just to start this up, but also for personal reasons. So that is something that we had been talking about for a long time. Parents getting older, be nice to have the children live here, whatever. Neither of us had been adults in India. So repatriation was a big deal, and we had talked about it so long and all of that. And the thing was that we figured out that if we move here, my husband could keep the job that would kind of keep the family running for a few years while I do this. So yeah, it's been very fortunate that he was able to kind of move with his job. We were able to figure that out in a way that worked for us economically also. Not that it was super easy. It's always hard to go from two sort of really good careers and the salaries to living on one person's income. And there was a lot around it for me, what it means to depend on somebody and all these layers of what finance means and what it is, even if it's your husband, right? Like the whole money is, it's my money and taking up space and all of that. So there's tons that we've worked through, even relationally, but yeah, it's been rewarding.
I appreciate you sharing that because it is complex, and that's part of the entrepreneurial journey too. A big part of what I think about with, leaving the traditional jobs is healthcare. There's just so many different things to think wherever you are in the world. And I know that's a big, bold question about what's been the best lesson from your journey so far, but you did such a beautiful job verbalizing that. I love that you said you have the right to exist, to take up space, and that you belong. It's such a wonderful takeaway. Thank you so much, Sangeetha, for taking so much time with us today and going through your journey and answering our questions, some of them really big and bold and difficult. Thank you, everyone that joined. Thank you for your perspectives. Andrea, for co-hosting with me today. So please feel free to let us know if you have nominations for other community members you think it would be powerful to hear from, and we will continue this cooperative learning experience. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Andrea. It's been a pleasure.
Have a wonderful weekend.
You've just finished another episode of Founders Voyage, the podcast for entrepreneurs by entrepreneurs. The team at Founders Voyage wants to thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We hope you enjoyed your time with us, and if so, please share this with someone else who might enjoy this podcast. You can also support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and by donating to our Patreon. Outro music today is Something for Nothing by Reverend Peyton's Big Damn Band.